Good morning, everybody. As we're in Barcelona, I should say, bon dia tothom. I'm not sure if we've got many Catalans in the room, but if we have, good morning to you as well. It's a pleasure to be here in Barcelona. It's one of my favorite cities, so I was very pleased to get the invitation. I got the invitation because I was speaking at another conference, and I spoke to somebody in the coffee break. Didn't talk about this conference, but she turned out to be somebody on the organizing committee of this conference. Dolores, I don't know if he's here today, and gave me the invitation. So not only will I find future research collaborators in the coffee breaks and in the discussions I have, but also find some visits to other lovely cities to come and talk at conferences. I'm going to talk today about digital literacy in the context of digital inclusion. I'm going to go through a little bit about technology and education. I think Donald's mentioned a few things and the way things have changed recently, but it's part of a very long pattern. And I'll talk briefly about that. I'll tell you what I understand by literacy. We're talking here about digital literacy, which for me is fundamentally literacy in a digital form. I'll then go on to talk about digital literacy, what I think it is, and how we should work with that concept and what we should understand by it, particularly in the context of adult learners and in terms of inclusion. I'll introduce Paulo Freire, the ideas of Paulo Freire, particularly this concept of reading the world before you read the world, to comment a little bit on digital literacy and inclusion in terms of digital literacy. And then I'll give some ideas about policy, what this might mean for education policy in different contexts. I won't talk very long about this because we all know this. Technology is everywhere. Even as an adult educator, and adult educators quite often don't get the best resources and don't get the newest technology as it comes out. But even as an adult educator, we're surrounded by technology that has significantly changed the way we interact with students, significantly changed the way we generate knowledge, the way we share knowledge, and has invaded classrooms, has invaded homes, and has invaded social space and invaded conferences in ways that are quite unexpected. And there are fabulous, amazing things that we can do now. The fact that there are so many people external to this room listening to this conference, the way we can replay and revisit the materials of a conference of this nature, the way that in a classroom we can be extremely interactive across time zones, interactive across physical, geographical boundaries, and in terms of the interaction with ideas that we can present to students. So computers, technology, the digital world, however we want to class it, and we could begin this in the 1960s, the 1950s, the 1920s, when new technologies were always being introduced to education, from blackboards to whiteboards to TVs to overhead projectors. That I'm sure there's some people in the room who remember overhead projectors. These were all new technologies that came into education and influenced it, influenced the way we worked and the way in which we were able to provide access to knowledge for learners. However, with all new technologies, there are difficulties, there are barriers to accessing those technologies. And that's something I think we need to pay a lot of attention to in education, in this very rich technological time, because those barriers mean that some people will miss out. Some people won't have access. Some people will be excluded from that new digital world. And as so much of our current value system is embedded in that, or the digital world is embedded in that, that's a very dangerous thing for us to do in societal terms. So when we talk about digital inclusion, the idea is that everybody has access to and is able to engage in the digital world in the same way they would engage in the non-digital world. I've worked on lots of computer programs, not programs as in software, but programs of education to digitalize or to computer literate, make people computer literate. Lots of them. And very frequently they fail quite badly. And this has always bothered me that there is a lot of equipment bought for new technology. And rooms are equipped with this stuff, screens and monitors and keyboards and CPUs, etc. All of the equipment in rooms, students, adults are brought in and expected to learn to use those machines, leave the building as digitally literate people. And I don't think it's as simple as that. And there's a number of good reasons why. On the screen, I've got what's called a digital inclusion pathway. This was written by a man called Steve Reeder, who's an academic in the University of Portland and quite a major figure in the world of adult literacy research. And he looked at adult learners, usually learners with low levels of literacy, and tried to work out what it would take for them to become digitally literate. And he created this pathway. And each of these pathways, there are different barriers in the stages. And if you look at the access stage, it might just be that there's no computers, there's no broadband. Therefore, there's a barrier in terms of access. We can solve that. We can give people computers, tablets, laptops, etc. That's how we get through the access barrier. And that's traditionally how it's been done. Put people in a room with technology, give them technology, teach them how to use that technology, and the situation will be resolved. What Reeder noted, and I think this is really, really helpful in lots of areas, is the second stage is a taste stage. There's a stage at which if you don't see why you should email, or if you don't see why you should start using a smartphone, you just won't. And I've worked with lots of particularly older adults to teach them email and to teach them the internet. And they learn it, they use it in the classroom, but they don't use it outside the classroom because they haven't got a taste for it. They don't really know why they want to use it. Okay, so this taste stage is particularly important and a particularly important barrier because it's invisible. It's not one that is easy to notice. Okay, so people need confidence, but particularly they need to know, well, why would I do this? What's in it for me? Why would I learn to use this equipment? The other ones we can see as more simplistic. The readiness barrier is the skills. Do I know how to do it? And then once you use this equipment and you begin to use your own tasks, you become digitally literate. Okay, so the digital inclusion pathway tells us that there's a really important barrier there that might be invisible, and it's a barrier which is around how important or why is this important to me, and what do I need to do with it? I won't talk for very long about literacy because it's not central, it's not the topic today, but I think there are really important concepts behind this term literacy, and I know literacy, the term in English doesn't translate well to many languages. And it actually is quite a disputed term, even in academic circles in the English language. So I'll give you what I think literacy is. Literacy for me is basically reading and writing. And that gets me in a lot of trouble if you say that, because that's a simplistic view of literacy, etc. But it's basically reading and writing. It's a foundational skill in that so much of what we do aside from literacy relies on literacy. Okay, so without literacy, you can't be an academic in any of the other areas. Without literacy, you can't access simple bits of information that you need to do your work tasks. Without literacy, you can't adequately support children who are going through a written word literate schooling system. So it's a foundational skill. Literacy is also contextual. It's not one thing. There isn't one set of skills that can be taught to somebody that provide them with literacy, that make them literate. It's entirely contextual. Depends on the situation you're in. It depends on the people you're with. And very importantly, it depends on what you want to achieve, which literacy you'll choose. And that, of course, brings us on to the idea that there isn't one literacy. There are literacies. There are literacies that are context dependent. If I have to write a legal letter, that's a form of reading and writing that I don't have. I can't do that. That's a literacy that I don't possess. If I'm writing a paper for an academic paper, that's a particular form of reading and writing that I need to engage in. If I don't, that paper will be rejected as being in the wrong register. Therefore, that's another another literacy. If I write to my family, if I talk to my friends, if I read the newspaper, these are all different literacies. If I read the Guardian newspaper in England, or I read the Sun newspaper in England, they're different literacies. They don't use the same literacy. Therefore, we talk about literacies to particularly make the distinction that there isn't one that everybody has to have. There are a whole series of different literacies that are contingent on your own circumstance and your own life. And that's because we all live in a very different, what we term a literate environment. So the demands on me as an individual in terms of reading and writing are different from the demands on everybody else in this room. We all have our own literate environment, and we choose to engage with this literate environment in different ways. Some of that through readiness. Are we ready to read that particular text, to engage with that, to write this? Certainly contextual. I don't need to, particularly also in terms of taste. I don't want to. I don't want to engage with that literacy, even though it's there. Okay, so our literate environment's very different. And within that literate environment, there are demands for us to use various literacies. And the final thing I'll say in terms of literacy is that literacy in every individual is a continuum. There isn't you either are literate or you are not literate. And the term illiterate is a very problematic term in the world of education because it implies that literacy is either or, that it's a binary. You either have it or you don't, when the reality is nowhere near that. When we work with adults on initial literacy, once they can form letters, write their name, I think in UNESCO terms, it's write a short note. That proves you're literate. That doesn't mean that when they leave that program, that they will continue to be literate. It doesn't mean that they can meet the literacy demands of their environment, because very few literacy demands, the literacy demand to write a short note is very unusual. It's not very useful outside certain contexts. So literacy is a continuum. We continue to develop our literacy as demands are made upon us and as we adapt to different circumstances. And as we all know in the room, all adults go through change in their life. Life changes around them, they change, therefore their needs are changed, their context changes, and they need to further develop their literacy. Okay, so that's literacy. Of course, literacy also has another use in English. As well as describing reading and writing, however we want to talk about literacy in that sense, literacy is also used sort of to signify a competence. So digital literacy, in many ways, means competent with the use of digital tools. Now, I think it means more than that. It says far more than that. But it is true that that word literacy is used. I don't think this is literacy. I think they're two separate things. This is literacy the concept of literacy within digital literacy is different, I think, than, for example, media literacy, which is another very common one. Ocean literacy is one that's out there. I've counted about 33 different combinations with literacy, a number of them. The majority of them aren't literacy, they're competence. With digital literacy, there's a halfway ground, because with digital literacy, we're not just talking about competence in digital tools, because we're also talking about production and reception of knowledge through that particular form. Interestingly, digital also has its own normative effect on the word that comes after it. Digital, it expands, it changes what comes after it. So digital literacy should be something different to literacy. And normally digital changes things by signaling progress, signaling development, change. Okay, so digital media, digital futures. These are all things that are signaling change. Therefore, the implication is that digital literacy is not digital competence, but it's a new literacy. That it's a new form of literacy where literacy has been changed by its insertion into the digital world. So it has this sense of being a competence, but it also has this normative effect, signaling that things are changing, there's development, and it's within this particular domain. Okay, but it is a lot more than just reading online. One of the key ideas of digital literacy is it's about using a series of skills in order to evaluate information, to find it, to evaluate it, and to respond to it. Okay? It's about connection and collaboration with other people. It's not simply a matter of translating literacy into digital or digitalizing literacy. There's far more to it than that. So we've got a couple of expressions here that you'll see very frequently associated with digital literacy. Use of digital tools, I've already mentioned, as one side of it. And there's a vast array of digital tools such that it's quite difficult to imagine education programs that are based around particular tools. The particular tools are almost an irrelevance because they're changing so quickly that learning how to use one tool inevitably means that next year you need to learn to use another tool. So that implies that digital literacy education needs to be broader and needs to take a more critical look at digital literacies. Digital practices, digitally mediated interactions, both with human and non-human actors, are central to somebody's digital literacy. Can they engage in this way? Can they use the technology to access this information, understand it, contextualize it in the appropriate way? And that brings to the last bullet point there, which is critical literacy. Within digital literacy, critical literacy is even more, I've said this before, critical literacy is even more important than it is with traditional literacy, with pen and paper literacy, but it's not true. It's not true. The criticality has always been hugely important to our understanding of the texts, the words that we're given and that mediate a lot of our lives. That they're all online, that they're far more frequently seen, that we're bombarded with far more text messages and information than we used to be, doesn't mean that when I'm reading a newspaper, when I'm reading The Guardian and when I'm reading The Sun, I don't also need to think about where that information comes from, who's put that information in the newspaper, what their purpose in doing that is, how I might question that information that's been given to me. That's critical literacy, and it applies equally to the digital world, which, as we all know, is quite a murky place. And it's often quite difficult to know, where did that message come from? And those skills are central to digital literacy. I'd say they're central to literacy as well. So that's digital literacy. So it's a very quick spin through a very complex thing. So when we think, if we've got literacy and we've got an understanding of literacy that takes into account that it's contextual, that takes into account there are various forms of literacy. And if we do accept that digital literacy, while it's different, the digital is working on the literacy is working on the digital to produce something distinct that isn't just simply straight literacy, but fundamentally shares a huge number of factors and a huge number of central concepts between digital literacy and literacy, then the logical thing to do is to start to look to those people who've thought a lot about literacy in order to think about how they might work with the term digital literacy. Now, obviously, Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator and philosopher. His most important work was probably in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Though he also was very influential in Brazil later when he came back and was from exile and was working in the government and introduced systems of popular education in Brazilian schools, particularly in São Paulo. His early literacy work was literacy campaigns. How to go to a place in the northeast of Brazil, very poor region, in which he went and he worked with the local community to develop adult literacy programs. Okay? And his writing is principally not about literacy. It's about poverty. Excuse me. It's about poverty, and it's about liberation, transformation of people's lives, with an understanding that literacy is a hugely significant factor in some of that oppression, in some of the difficulties that people have in their lives. And he wanted to transform the lives of the people he saw in his country who didn't have access to education as children, or had access to poor education, and had grown up without reading and writing. And there's a couple of things here about his writing. I won't go into. There's a number of very, very interesting concepts. I mean, if you haven't read Paulo Freire, or you haven't read about Paulo Freire, then I really encourage you to take that as a study task from this morning, because he said many, many things that resonate across the whole of education, particularly for work of people like me who work with adults in basic education. There's so many things he said that are significant and useful and applicable. And one of those is this concept, the central concept he had, that learning to read and write is not a mechanical process. It's not just about learning how you form the letters. It's not just about looking at the sound and letter patterns. It's not about learning to read and write. What reading and writing, in order to learn to read and write, Freire said that the most important thing was that the learning came from the life of the people who were learning. Therefore, he developed with the people, he began the classes, the courses, by talking to people about their lives, gathering together what he calls a series of words together in a word universe. And that represents the community that those people live in. Therefore, the words that they're talking about, they're also talking about the issues that they have in that community. And if those issues are around, I don't know, access to transport, then they'll be using a lot of words, the bus stop, the train, whatever the language is. Those words will then form the curriculum of the adult literacy intervention. They'll learn to write those words. And as they learn to write those words, they'll then use those words to advocate for change in the local area. You might write a letter to the local bus company, to the council, to the government, to ask for better transport services. And he called this reading the world before you read the word. But the words you finally read should be ones that resonate with you. They should be ones that you can see, you use in your life, they're relevant to your life, and therefore writing about them, reading about them, is also hugely relevant to your life, to the way you work. Now, if we think back to Reader's digital inclusion framework, this is very similar to the idea of digital taste. The thing I learn, whether that's reading and writing, or whether that's to use a particular computer, must be centered in my experience of the world. It must come from me. It can't be imposed on me externally. It can be, but it's likely to be far less successful if it is. And that chimes really with my experience of working with adults, that you need to bring adults with you, or much more simply, to go with the adults where they want to go in order to engage them in any form of learning. Let me move on from Freire's there. This second quote. This is just another quote about reading the world. That I think is very nice. And thinking about this concept in terms of digital literacy, this implies that we need to work with learners very, very intensely to find out what it is that the digital world, using literacy in digital form, engaging with digital media, would help. Okay. Now, his approach to adult literacy centered around these word universes, these which he called generative themes. So it might be transport, access to transport was a generative theme, a discussion around this generative theme, leading to a word universe that then becomes the curriculum for the adult literacy program. And it's central to what he believed was that curriculum, those words, came from the learners. They begin with the learners, they're situated in the learners' lives, and therefore they're effective, they're powerful, and they're recognizable by those particular learners. Now, I think there are parallels with Reader's concept of digital taste. Until an adult can see the relevance of what is being proposed, they won't engage. And Freire's concept of a word universe, of this generative theme, was to center the learning in the lived experience of those adults. So an adult first needs to read the digital world. Now, what does it mean if you read the digital world? I think it's very similar to Reader's concept of taste. You're looking at the digital world and you're positioning yourself within it, and you're understanding your relation to it. And it might be that currently there is no relation between this adult and the digital world because they're digitally excluded. And our job and where we started is for digital inclusion. But you can't simply digitalize that person. You can't simply tell them what they have to learn. You have to give them the chance to locate that learning in their own world. And of course, with Freire, what he wanted to do was to transform that world. So this is not a passive approach in any way at all. It's an approach that prioritizes transformation, prioritizes change in those adults' lives, social change, particularly social and economic change. And therefore, there's a recognition that won't happen without adults really buying into this. So I've got a couple of slides just with some implications. And obviously, these are very general implications, with me imagining my own adult education system, me imagining the experiences I've had working with adults around digital technologies. You will have had different experiences. Some of these implications will work for you, some of them probably won't. And I'd be interested to hear later other thoughts that you have. Firstly, and this is really important, as I said before, each of these barriers, each of these stages has a barrier. We need to remove those barriers. As an absolute starting point, we need to remove those barriers. The initial one, the access stage, the readiness stage, that seems quite straightforward. We already do that. We equip classrooms, we train teachers. We have a curriculum, teach people, give them the skills, equip them with the skills. The barrier that Reader notes, that Freire has also commented on extensively, this idea of taste. How do we make sure that adults can see what it is, how it is they would benefit from engaging with this technology? And unfortunately, we very often don't do very well in the second stage because we don't try to understand where the learner is. We assume that we know the learner's in my class because they need digital skills. I'll give them digital skills. They'll leave my class, resume their life better. But that's not really how adults work. So one of the key messages I take from reading Paulo Freire is the huge importance of understanding your learners, talking to your learners, making sure that the course is not imposed on them, but is rather derived from them and their own interests. We very frequently take a deficit approach when we look at adult skills. We look at what they can't do. An older person comes to my classroom. Why would I assume that they can't use digital skills? Why would I assume they're having transferable skills from another area? Why would I assume that they lack something rather than thinking, here's a very experienced person who knows much more about the world than me? I will work with that to help them to engage with this technology. So we've seen, and to conclude on this one, we've seen that you need critical consciousness, hugely important for digital literacy. The world is very murky, but it's the same thing with any literacy. We do need the same skills. We do need to be critical to question where information comes from. People need an awareness of constraints on what people can do digitally. This impacts on taste as well. There are constraints on what we can do. Some of them to do with information, some of them to do with access, some of them to do with our own circumstances. And we need to understand that in order to try and encourage people to do things that they actually want to do. when adults learn, the reason they go to a class is motivation. Normally, internal motivation. There are extrinsic, external motivations in terms of gaining qualifications. But even when an adult needs that qualification, if internally they want to learn what that qualification assesses, they'll learn it much more effectively. And the same thing goes with digital literacy. We need to listen to them very carefully so that we can understand their lived experience. If we understand their lived experience, we can design the education program around them. And really important, I'd like to finish on this note. Digital literacy is not just about equipping people with skills. Literacy, adult literacy, reading and writing is not just contextual. And therefore, as educators, we need to be aware of that in order to design programs that truly engage adult learners. Thank you very much. I'll finish on that.